Welcome to History, Mystery, and the Unexplained, the show where we look at everything from true crime to cryptids, the paranormal, and beyond. Today, we're going to look at 3 murder cases that have left behind many questions that have puzzled researchers for decades, one of which you most likely never heard of. And the other 2? Well, you might not know the whole story. And before we begin, please like, subscribe, follow, or whatever on the platform of your choice. And leave us a comment. I'd love to hear what you think. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. You most likely have heard the nursery rhyme about Lizzie Borden at some point in your life. And if you're like most people, you think that's the whole story. Lizzie never went to prison, or as the second verse states, she was never hung for her crimes. In fact, Lizzie was found innocent, and she most likely was. Lizzie Borden was born in July of 1860 in Fall River, Massachusetts, the youngest daughter of Andrew and Sarah Borden. Sadly, her mother passed away when she was only 2 years old, and her sister Emma was 12. Her father remarried a few years later to a woman named Abby Dumfrey Gray. But it is noted that the children never took to Abby as their mother. Lizzie actually referred to her as Miss Borden. That being said, they also referred to their maid, Bridget Sullivan, as Maggie. Why? Because the last maid was Maggie, and why bother to remember a whole new name just for a servant? Classy. Later in life, they accused Abby of being a gold digger who married their father for his money. There is no doubt that Andrew Borden was well off, having a net worth of about 8 to 10 million in today's dollars. But he was extremely tight-fisted with his money. If Abby Borden was a gold digger, she was playing the long game. And despite his wealth, the family lived in the poor part of town rather than on the hill with the rest of the wealthy of the area. When the sisters would ask for money to attend events, their father usually refused. He found such things frivolous. The Borden girls didn't really fit in anywhere. Their father's wealth often ostracized them from the poorer classmates, but their lack of allowance prevented them from making friends on the hill. This could be a large part of why neither girl ever married. Kind of hard to find Mr. Right when you don't have a social circle. Now, before we get into what occurred on the August 4th of 1892, there's one other thing I want to mention. From a modern perspective, it seems odd that Lizzie and Emma were still living with their parents at the time of the murders. Lizzie was 32 and Emma 42. This is because they were unmarried. These days, unmarried women can do whatever they want in most countries. At that time, however, an unmarried woman would be frowned upon if they were to live alone if they had living parents. On August 3rd, 1892, John Morse arrived at the Borden house to stay a few nights. He was the brother of the late Sarah Borden and the biological uncle of Emma and Lizzie. This is the same day Andrew, Abby, and Bridget all fell ill. Abby visited Dr. Bowen across the street, believing that she had been poisoned. The doctor gave her some castor oil and told her that it was food poisoning. That evening, Lizzie was visiting her neighbor and friend, Alice Russell. During this visit, Lizzie voiced her concern that someone might kill her father. The next day, John Morris and Andrew Borden both left the house just after breakfast. Emma was out visiting friends about 15 miles away. This left only Lizzie, Abby, and Bridget at the house. Despite the fact that Bridget was still vomiting from the previous day's food poisoning, she was ordered to wash the windows outside. According to her own testimony, Lizzie was getting sinkers for an upcoming fishing trip from the loft in the barn. around this time, approximately 9:30 a.m., someone assaulted Ably Borden with an axe in the guest room John had been staying in. She was struck in the head 17 to 18 times. At 11 a.m., Andrew returned home, finding the door deadbolted shut. He pounded on the door, and Bridget let him in. He, too, was feeling under the weather and decided to take a nap on the couch. Seeing the opportunity to lay down herself, Bridget retired to her room on the third floor. A short time later, she was awoken by screaming downstairs. Lizzie had found the mutilated body of her father. He also was struck 10 to 11 times in the head. It wouldn't take long for Bridget Sullivan to find the body of Abby on the floor of the bedroom. The number one suspect was Lizzie Borden. She was officially arrested on August 11th, 1892. Obviously, she had opportunity. She was one of the only people at the home at the time. But what about motive? What reason would she have to kill her father and her stepmother? The most common reason given is money. Prior to the murders, the tight-fisted Andrew had gifted property to Abby's sister. It was thought that Lizzie and Emma might have felt their inheritance was in jeopardy. That being said, the sisters had approached their father when that happened, and he agreed it was only fair that they got property as well, which she gave them, and then they sold back to their father. And besides greed, some researchers suggest that she may have had an incestuous relationship with her father. This is unsubstantiated, with no real evidence backing it up. It's also suggested that she may have had relations with Bridget and was discovered by Abby. Again, this is without merit. The last theory given is that she was seeking revenge because Andrew had murdered her pigeons. Okay, there were pigeons that lived in the barn, and her father did kill them. She talked about this on the stand, and from the sound of it, they probably ate squab that night. So we have questionable motives at best, but considering the time frame between Andrew coming home and him being discovered, Lizzie must have been covered in blood, right? No. The only blood found was a bucket of sanitary napkins in the basement. It was argued that she could have committed the crime naked, then cleaned the weapon and herself, hiding the evidence among the menstrual rags. Not only does this seem preposterous, but I feel I should mention that the house had no running water. Cleaning herself up in such a short time frame would have proven difficult. The prosecution also pointed out that two other damning pieces of evidence. On the third, she had attempted to buy prussic acid. It was insinuated that she had planned to use this to poison her family. She said that she wanted to clean a seal skin. Regardless, she was unsuccessful with the purchase. They also point to the timeline. If, as suggested, there is a 1 to 2 hour gap between the murders, it makes it very difficult to point the finger at anyone else. This, too, was put into question at the trial and is still a point of debate today. Some suggest that there could have been as little as 15 minutes between the murders. A final note before we move on, the police love to point out the fact that Lizzie changed her story a lot. Her doctor had her on a double dose of morphine for anxiety. The jury only deliberated for about an hour and a half before finding her innocent. There is more than enough reasonable doubt. Okay, so if not Lizzie, then who did it? William. I know. Who the hell is William? This is the theory that William Borden is the illegitimate love child of Andrew Borden. He wasn't, but it's a theory. We can then skip all the details here, just say that it wasn't William. What about John Morris? He showed up with no luggage, planning to stay for an indeterminate amount of time, and was heard having an argument with Andrew that morning. There have been several books and papers written from this point of the theory, but there's a lack of motive. The best theory here is that he did it either in conjunction with one or both of the sisters or as a favor because greed. There is also a suggestion that Emma did it, popped over from her friend's house, did the deed, slipped out. Remember, she was only a few miles away. This doesn't seem likely, though. This leaves us with a random stranger, drifter, or someone Andrew teed off. Honestly, it's really hard to point the finger at anyone. And that's what's so fascinating about this case. This is one of those cases that will probably never be solved. It's worth mentioning that Lizzie and Emma did finally get their house on the hill. After their father's passing, they named it Maplecroft. Lizzie loved to throw lavish parties for actors when they passed through. She loved the theater. Sadly, the sisters had a falling out, and Emma eventually left and refused to return. Neither ever said what the argument was about. They lived about 30 more years in freedom. Despite their physical distance, they died exactly 9 days apart of natural causes. Today, of course, if you're a morbid tourist, you can spend a night in the very room where Abby was murdered. And why not? John did the very next day. Today, the home is a bed and breakfast. The Hinterkaifeck murders are kind of the Lizzie Borden of Germany. They left behind more questions than answers, keeping people pondering for years to come. As recently as 2007, the case was reopened by a police academy team for re-examination with modern forensic methods. It's one of those cases that the first time I heard about it, I really wanted to share it with everyone. I wanted to talk about it and analyze it because it's so filled with mystery. In September of 1922, the Gruber family's live-in maid suddenly quit. She had been complaining for some time that she was hearing noises in the attic. Sometimes she heard whispers and tapping. The family patriarch, Andreas Gruber, checked the attic several times and found nothing. The maid couldn't take it anymore. She wasn't going crazy. There was someone or something in the house, and she wasn't taking any chances. The Hinterkaifeck farm was a very remote farm, 70 kilometers north of Munich, surrounded by forest. It was the home of 63-year-old Andreas Gruber and his wife, 71-year-old Cecilia. Their widowed daughter, 35-year-old Victoria Gabriel, and her children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. Initially, the family dismissed the maid's thoughts about the farm. It wasn't haunted or whatever she believed. But after a while, he started hearing things too. And making matters worse, there were the footprints. In March, a small dusting of snow covered the ground, and footprints came from the woods ending at the machine shed. They didn't go back. Everything was searched thoroughly, but again, nothing was found. As the months went on, the strangeness intensified. A newspaper turned up in the house. It was a paper that no one in the house subscribed to. It wasn't a paper anyone in the town even subscribed to. It was from Munich, and it left many questions as to how it might have gotten there. Around this time, a set of keys also went missing, and according to some reports, the Grubers told some of their neighbors that they were seeing a mustached stranger on the outskirts of the farm. Again, this is rural Germany. This isn't the kind of place where you just stroll up on your neighbor. March 31st, 1922, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, turned up for her first day at work. Unfortunately, this would also be the last day of her life. That night, Andreas and the two Cecilias and Victoria were each led into the barn one by one. They were struck in the head with a mattock, a piece of farm equipment in the same family as a pickaxe. Then the killer or killers made their way into the house where they brutally murdered Maria and little Joseph. Details on what occurred over the next few days vary depending on the article you read or the podcast you listen to. This is a case over 100 years old. Sensationalism, shoddy memory. There's a lot of reasons details may be different. That being said, as the long and short of it is, over the next few days, people came through. The mailman, coffee suppliers, a mechanic. They all note smoke coming from the chimney, a lantern burning. Doors were unlocked and relocked. The dog was inside and outside. Even the cows got milked. Someone was taking care of things, but no one saw the groupers. Albert Hoffner was at the farm for 4 hours working on a motor in the machine room, and no one ever came out to greet him. Little Cecilia wasn't seen at school, and although that it wasn't unusual for the elder groupers to keep to themselves, 4 days of not going into town was very unusual for Victoria. Neighbor Lawrence Schlittenbauer decided to investigate. First, he sent his son, Johann, 17, and his stepson, Joseph, 9, around 3:30 on April 4th. They came back having found nothing. Then Lawrence himself, along with Michael Pohl and Jacob Siegel, decided to investigate. They found the doors to the home all locked and are said to have heard noises coming from the barn. How? Who knows? The family had been dead for 4 days. The men broke down the door and quickly found 4 victims stacked one upon another in a pile of hay. Lawrence then turned to the house to investigate further, where he uncovered the other 2 bodies. Michael and Jacob remained in the barn. It took hours for the police to arrive. Again, middle of nowhere. The neighbors, however, descended upon the farm in droves. They trampled over the farm, the barn, the home, everywhere. Even some of them took souvenirs here and there, long before the bodies were ever examined. So here comes the fun part. Who did it? Let's start with the most ridiculous. Carl Gabriel. That last name might sound familiar. This is the late husband of Victoria Gabriel. Wait, he died 7 years ago, right? Officially, yes, he was killed in a battle in France in 1914. The legend, however, suggests that he faked his death and fled to Russia. The proof of this is that they never found his body. They never found a lot of bodies in World War I. Also, during World War II, there was a Russian prison guard with a German accent that claimed to have committed the murders. But why? That's when we get into the disgusting truth of some of the family dynamics. Unlike the unwarranted accusations in the Lizzie Borden case, it is a matter of court record that Andreas Gruber had an incestuous relationship with his own daughter. He was caught sexually assaulting Victoria. He only served 1 year in prison for the crime. In an insane moment of victim blaming, she also served a month in prison. Doing the math, Joseph is obviously not the son of Carl and may have been the son of his own grandfather. Returning to the legend, it is thought that Carl may have returned, become enraged by what he saw, and murdered the whole family. This doesn't account for the 6 months of living, or at least visiting the house and barn, or for, okay, maybe it gives motive for the father-in-law, but his wife, his own daughter, I don't buy it. The second person typically pointed at is the very neighbor who found the bodies, Lawrence Schlittenbauer. It is rumored that after his first wife's death in 1918, he may have had a relationship with Victoria, fathering Joseph. It is even suggested that he asked Andreas for permission for her hand in marriage, and Andreas refused. The main suspicious activity usually pointed at is his breaking into the barn first and then checking the house. If no one was alive to make the noise, what did he hear that caused him to believe something was in there? The police did find 2 areas in the barn where the hay was matted down, like someone had been sleeping there. Was the killer right there when the men arrived? If so, how did he slip away? when no one was looking. To make matters even stranger, he entered the house alone with keys. Remember the set of keys that was said to be missing? As damning as this might seem, it is also possible that as a neighbor, he had a set of keys in case of emergencies. If that was the case, most likely he only had a key to the house and not the barn. Also, let's take another look at this motive. Sure, it gives him possible reason to kill Andreas, but his lover, his son, again, there are some serious holes here. And courts at the time agreed. He won several civil suits for slander against locals who accused him of being the murderer. The most common and most likely motives given for the murders is either a random drifter who stayed in the house and barn before and for some time after the murders, or two, locals disgusted by the family relations. It's well documented that Andreas was not well liked in the community. There is no shortage of suspects, but the evidence isn't great. Most of it amounts to deathbed confessions or confessions made to priests, comments overheard, or simply memories of shady people in the area. In other words, lots of hearsay. Supposedly, that 2007 study did narrow things down to a single individual, but given the age of the case, that individual is long since dead. Out of respect for that suspect's living relatives, they decided never to release the findings. This leaves things to remain a mystery, most likely until the end of time. Officially speaking, the Ably House murder is solved. Jacob Abbley was murdered by his own son, Joseph, in 1877. But how do we get there? In the 1830s, Garrett Bias and his wife Polly moved their young family to Council Hill Station, Illinois. They hired a young girl, Katharina, to help date around the house day to day. Then, one day in the 1840s, Polly suddenly passed away and was buried quickly. 6 months later, Garrett's daughter passed away as well. Garrett then married his live-in maid, Katharina, and they hired a man, Jacob Ably. Garrett and Katharina went on to have 2 children of their own, Emily in 1847 and Katharina in 1849. Then Garrett suddenly passed away. The death looked suspicious, as he had been in good health. But nonetheless, he was buried and life went on. Garrett's son Hiram then moved to California, like so many others around that time following the gold rush. Mind you, he had no living relatives left in the house, and his stepmom was 3 years his senior. And let's not forget all the mysterious deaths. There may have been other motives besides gold, is what I'm saying. As could be expected with this strange tale, Katharina then married Jacob Ably. In 1860, the remaining Bias children, Emily and Katharina, suddenly passed away. Jacob and Katharina then had 3 children of their own, Henry, Joseph, and Jacob Jr. And here is where our tale suddenly breaks the pattern. Jacob is noted as being abusive towards Katharina and the eldest child, Henry. At one point, he even drove Henry away from the home for defending his mother. In 1877, however, things went a little too far. Katharina was found hanging from a tree in front of the house. It was assumed that she had taken her own life. But the Ably boys told a different story. They said that their father had killed her. Just 8 months later, Jacob too would be dead. His sons were quickly arrested, as well as a neighbor child, Peter Miller Jr. It's stated that Peter's testimony is what convicted Joseph. He said that the 4 of them had gone to the farm that night to pick grapes, and that Joseph had run off to find his father. While they were busy in the field, they heard gunshots. Peter ran towards them, only to find Joseph running in the other direction. Joseph had just shot his father. Only Joseph was convicted of the crime. He died in prison 10 years later, putting an end to this strange tale of the Ably House. That's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed the stories. Till next time, I'm Christopher Damian. This is History, Mystery, and the Unexplained. And thank you for listening.